I'm actually a literary scholar, so I normally spend a great deal of time thinking about translation and untranslatability, but I actually wanted to extend myself a little bit beyond the literary. And so instead of talking about words, I want to talk about images, and rather than speaking about untranslatability as a linguistic problem, I thought I would speak about incommensurability as a cultural, but also fundamentally as a geographical or spatial problem. How to think about distance and proximity, and the ways in which the aesthetic mediates between them as a problem. And my talk then is basically going to be split into two sections. The first section, which is only a few pages, is going to be a more general kind of set of reflections on space and scale, spatial scale, and specifically the way in which we might want to think about the global, the regional, the national, and the local, which has been in many ways the sort of the scalar paradigm that has been a part of the scaffolding of this conference of the previous days. And then move towards a specific case study, which is going to be Niko Pirosmani, an early 20th century painter from the Georgian capital of Tbilisi, or Tiflis as it was called at that time. So my talk is in a sense going to perform a kind of scalar movement, even as it also tries to methodologically analyze it, as I'm going to be moving from the global to the local, but also from the abstract to the sensuous, and also from sobriety, as you will see, to certain forms of inebriation. So the premise of untranslatability rests on the opacity of signs, the assumption that the sonic, elusive, or symbolic dimensions of words and images constitute a privileged barrier. This is a barrier which humanists can interpret but never completely overcome. Indeed, it is a barrier the humanist may even seek to perpetuate for the simple reason that it constitutes our professional justification, the basis of language training, close reading, and formal analysis, without which no student or practitioner of art and literature could thrive. Yet does cultural difference or linguistic particularity necessarily generate incommensurability? My concern here is this. If difference appears to offer us a place of resistance from which to critique false universals, be it cultural Eurocentrism, global English, or high art, it also risks fetishizing incommensurability as a problem of cultural semiosis before understanding it firstly as a problem of space, of how space is produced, projected, imagined, and lived. Today I want to address this question in two ways. Firstly, by sharing a few general thoughts on the global turn from the perspective of the literary scholar, and secondly, by offering a particularly intriguing case study, that of a peripheral painter, Niko Pirosmanashvili, or Niko Pirosmani as he's generally known, from a peripheral city, Tbilisi, today the capital of the Republic of Georgia, whose entry into the 20th century canon of modernist art is in many ways exemplary of the institutional legacies we are today seeking to critically re-examine. Let me begin with some general observations on the global and the local, a problem which Zvenka Badovinac framed so beautifully for us in her keynote lecture on Friday. My concern is that world literary studies today seems caught between two competing spatial models. On the one hand, an abstract globalism, frequently mapped as a dynamic center of hierarchical relations between centers and peripheries, and on the other, an insistence upon cultural specificity and artistic agency, verifiable to the extent that it is site-specific or as a material circuit of exchange, traceable as a series of interconnected networks. In essence, we are faced with two, possibly three, apparently antithetical understandings of cultural space. Resting as it does on the foundational assumption of a unified, albeit uneven planetary scale, generally identified with modernity or capitalism, the center-periphery model underpins some of the most influential theorizations of world literature to have arisen in recent decades. Most commonly derived from world systems analysis, these theories model the dynamic of literary circulation across world regions, according to the uneven access to socioeconomic and cultural resources, which distinguishes the world's dominant centers from semi-peripheral or peripheral regions. The inequalities between center and periphery are perceived as the byproduct of two distinct spatial logics proper to the modern era: the deterritorializing dynamic of the expanding world market and the reterritorializing effect of the prevailing Westphalian system of sovereign and competing nation states. It might well be argued that alternatives to the planetary scale of world systems theory merely privilege one of these two spatial logics over the other. In other words, either the market or the nation, without examining the deeper correlation between the nation state and the market. Site-specific scholarship is practiced by area studies specialists, and I'm one of them by professional training, generally reifies local, national, or regional space, the latter often the legacy of pre-modern world systems, while the network model views world literature as not as a fixed canon of texts, but as whatever is gained, culturally speaking, when texts, or indeed paintings, undergo translation or transnational circulation. Implicitly or explicitly, then, each model privileges the determining force of a given spatial scale. Put simply, the global versus the local, the national, or the regional, as well as a specific patterning of space, vertical structure versus horizontal network. It is worth recalling at this point that scale is not merely a matter of empirical size, whereby each lesser scale is subsumed by a greater scale, like so many Russian nesting dolls. The geographer Neil Smith has distinguished three kinds of scale. Cartographic scale, which refers to the level of abstraction at which a map is constructed, and which, I might add, also offers the conceptual grid upon which such territorial entities as nations and empires can be designated. Methodological scale, involving some kind of compromise between the research problem and the availability of data. And finally, geographical scale, which follows specific processes in the physical and human landscape. Complementing but also critiquing the cartographical and methodological abstractions which dominate most debates on the global, the geographical scale of lived space can be readily seen as the embodied realm of human sociality and everyday cultural practice. Could a more lucid awareness of spatial scale, as well as cross-scalar movement, then, be one way to pursue cross-cultural interpretation that allows for negotiations between the local, the regional, and the global? Let me now turn, as one example, to Georgia's most celebrated 20th century painter, Niko Pirosmani. As you can see, his dates are, his dates are 1862 to 1918. A partially literate autodidact from the Georgian countryside who received no formal training in the arts, Pirosmani lived much of his life on the very margins of urban society, eking out a living by commission, painting works which serve to adorn as well as advertise the stores, cellars, and taverns owned and frequented by the popular classes of the Georgian capital, Tbilisi. For those of you who are familiar either with Georgian or Russian, you will note, in fact, that although I've translated it into normative or standard English as cold beer, the Russian холодный piva, which is at the top, and the Georgian sivi piva at the bottom are both, in fact, non-standard. The adjective cold is in the neuter. Is in the masculine, while the Russian word for beer is neuter. And similarly, the Georgian text below is also essentially a kind of macaronic vernacular of the street. It's not actually standard Georgian, just as the Russian is not standard either. Pirosmani's works range from still life to genre painting, historical canvases to animal figures, both local and exotic. His material resources, always minimal, generally determined the mode of composition. His color palette was limited, and he painted mainly on cardboard, oilcloth, and even tin. Thematically defined by the immediate demands of the tavern keepers and shop owners who paid him, Pirosmani's works nevertheless recall the formal solutions of a long-standing regional culture of church facades, frescoes, tombstones, and watchtowers, which he adapted to entirely new means and ends. A functioning part of a lived environment of local commerce and consumption, Pirosmani's work circulated entirely outside the realm of high art and aesthetic appreciation, until it was, I quote, discovered in the summer of 1912 by several still teenage representatives of the Russian, or better still Russophone avant-garde, who scoured the commercial spaces of Tiflis in search of his work, which they interpreted through the lens of the broadly modernist fascination with the primitive. Pablo Picasso's Banquet of 1908, given in honor of the so-called naive painter Henri Rousseau, likely served as a model and precedent for the avant-garde artists who interacted with Pirosmani on the eve of World War I. Modernist primitivism found its Russian-Eurasian inflection in Alexander Shevchenko's Neo-Primitivist Manifesto of 1913 and the related Target Mishень exhibition held in Moscow during the same year, a landmark event in the history of the Russian avant-garde which catapulted Pirosmani from the commercial spaces of the tavern and the shop front to his first gallery exhibition display. It was largely in response to the Russian primitivist recuperation of Pirosmani that Georgian intellectuals on the eve of World War I, but particularly after the Soviet annexation of Georgia in 1922, were subsequently moved to transform Pirosmani from a local primitive into a national icon. Pirosmani's canonization is a paradigmatic instance of a local and regional vernacular practice recuperated in the service of a global and elite discourse on art. The retrieval of Pirosmani's legacy is a story of two distinct models competing but also colluding in the artist's canonization: the cosmopolitan discourse of modernist primitivism and a nationalizing discourse of local particularity. Both discourses, in their distinctness, but also in their mutual complicity, found an exemplary expression in Pirosmani's belated and largely posthumous rise to fame. How then does the story of Pirosmani relate to the problem of incommensurability? On the one hand, Pirosmani is doubtless one of many instances of aesthetic modernism arising on the periphery of Western Europe, emerging at the point of convergence between at the point of convergence of apparently irreconcilable polarities: the elite and the vernacular, the cosmopolitan and the national. At the same time, the story of Pirosmani differs in one essential respect from the broader story of European primitivism, in which this museum in which we're all located, we might recall, played a significant if controversial role. I'm thinking, of course, of the 1984 MoMA exhibition, Primitivism in 20th Century Art, Affinity of the Tribal and the Modern, and James Clifford's critique of it in The Predicament of Culture. Gauguin's Polynesian adventure and Picasso's fascination for African sculpture presupposed a transcontinental voyage of recovery, preceded and facilitated by European imperialism. By contrast, the Russophone and Georgian artists who discovered Pirosmani were mostly native to the city in which he lived, even as they were taking their cues from Paris, Moscow, and St. Petersburg. An important element of what we might call Eurasian modernism is the persistence of local and regional scales of cultural encounter and exchange, in striking contrast to the more familiar transcontinental and transoceanic or transregional scales typical of modernisms arising from encounters between the global north and the global south. This local regional scale acquired its definitive performative embodiment in the pervasive practice of feasting and drinking, to which Pirosmani repeatedly returned. Here you can see a wall decoration to a particular drinking place of sort of drinking and revelry, the so-called Bieli Dukhan, situated on the outskirts of Tbilisi, and he was particularly interested in decorating taverns. That was one of his sort of most frequent commissions. And here you see what was called a feuilleton, or feuilleton, I think we say in English as well, of various merrymakers arriving at the scene of that particular tavern. Pirosmani also repeatedly returned to the theme of the feast and painted various kinds of feasts on repeated occasions. While the Georgian feast has been elevated and reified as a national tradition, transcending and reconciling class as well as the urban-rural divide during the... and here's a 19th century postcard photograph in which festivity, or kutyosh as in Russian, is essentially being here reified as a kind of typological feature of the Caucasian peoples. What I want to suggest is that while the Georgian feast has today been largely reified as a national tradition, I want to suggest something perhaps a little bit more interesting, which is the possibility of rethinking the feast at a particular moment in time and space as an alternative to the apparently incommensurable spaces of the museum as a citadel of high art on the one hand, and the tavern as a space of ephemeral consumption on the other. Right? And in other words, I want to invite us to think about the possibility of the feast as a space of proximity and contiguity that allows us to possibly negotiate certain kinds of differences in a kind of horizontal, if not utopia, or at least a heterotopia. And I want to leave you with this final image that I want to briefly discuss as I reach my conclusion. While the Georgian feast has been elevated to the status of a national tradition transcending and reconciling class as well as the urban-rural divide, during the Russian Revolution, when Georgia became a haven for displaced artists and poets, the heterotopian potential of ritualized revelry, which Tiflis offered, came to function as a vernacular corollary to artistic bohemia, the café culture of Paris, Vienna, or St. Petersburg, which we know to be the cradle of European modernist poetry and painting. To make my point clearer, I leave you then with this final image, a newspaper cartoon of the time, illustrating the two distinct yet physically proximal vectors of cultural production and festive consumption in revolutionary Tiflis. So here you have, and again, the text is primarily in Russian, a cafe with several people drinking and being intimate, dressed in distinctly European clothes, more or less in the center of the cartoon, but surrounding them also Georgians dressed in what would be called traditional costumes, feasting and drinking alongside what looks like a woman dressed in this kind of flapper costume from the jazz era. And I want to suggest that we might want to think about this particular image as a way of thinking about how space, lived space, and festive space might function as a kind of mediating moment between what would otherwise be the incommensurable spaces of the museum, in which the museums in which Pirosmani's paintings now reside, and the taverns from which they were extracted, purchased, and bought. So the story of Pirosmani then, and of the regional crossroads city of Tbilisi in which he lived and painted, thus allows us to view the apparently incommensurable vectors of the modern in close proximity. In other words, a kind of what we see here, a kind of multiplication of the very notion of bohemia, which has been understood to be the cradle, if you like, of European modernism, where the bohemian spaces of the café cabaret from Paris or St. Petersburg can be seen alongside, in radical proximity, to the festive spaces of a long-standing local tradition of revelry, of drinking, feasting, and bardic minstrelsy and poetic recitation. And that's precisely the image that I want to leave you with, in which spatial contiguity it becomes a mode of coexistence, allowing for horizontal negotiations as well as vertical appropriations. Thank you very much.